At 26,000 feet, the night doesn't feel like night anymore. It feels like a vacuum, silent, thin, and unforgiving, where every breath sounds like a confession you didn't mean to make. We were filming on Everest because the world loves a summit story, the heroic angles, the flags snapping in the wind, the triumphant voiceovers. But there's a version of Everest that never makes it into documentaries, a version that belongs to darkness, to the dead, and to the few living who are stubborn enough to keep climbing when their instincts are screaming, "Turn back." That night, our team set the camera on a tripod beside a ridge of ice that looked like broken glass under the moon. We wanted a clean shot, headlamps drifting like fireflies across the slope, stars trembling above the black outline of the mountain. Just one perfect sequence for the film. Then the wind died, not gradually, not naturally. It stopped the way a door slammed shut. And in that sudden stillness, the camera picked up movement where nothing should have been moving, high on a shoulder of snow beyond the reach of our lights. The image was faint at first, a shape tall and wrong, crossing the slope without sinking. No crunch, no stumble, no trail. We didn't notice it with our eyes. We noticed it because the sensor did, because the screen showed what our fear refused to accept. A figure turned its head, not toward our path, toward the lens. The next 10 seconds are the reason I never sleep through a storm anymore, the reason I refuse to watch the raw footage alone, and the reason our expedition leader, an old climber who had survived avalanches, crevasses, and the death zone itself, leaned close to me and said, in a voice so calm it terrified me, "If it knows we saw it, we're already late." People imagine Everest as a clean challenge, altitude, ice, and willpower. But the mountain isn't clean. It's layered with old storms, old gear, old prayers, names scratched into metal, ropes bleached white, and the silent presence of those who never came back down. Our expedition wasn't a rescue mission, and it wasn't a summit push meant to break records. It was a documentation project. 4 climbers, 2 Sherpa guides, and me, the one tasked with bringing proof back to the world. Proof of beauty, proof of danger, proof that humans can still reach places that seem forbidden. But the mountain doesn't care about proof. We started like every team starts, careful, excited, pretending confidence could replace oxygen. We planned night shots at Camp 2, then higher, where the stars are brutally sharp and the horizon bends like a dark blade. We brought extra batteries inside our jackets, kept lenses warm, checked radios twice. Everything was measured. Everything, except what we didn't believe existed. Because there are things people whisper about in base camp when the tea runs out and the wind begins to talk against the tents. Shapes seen through spindrift, footprints that don't match crampons, a presence that moves above the glacier like it's floating, always at the edge of vision, never in the center. We laughed it off, until we didn't. In this story, you're going to follow what happened across 4 chapters, each one pulling us higher into the death zone and deeper into the kind of fear that doesn't come from falling, fear that comes from being noticed. Before we begin, take a second to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy intense survival narratives and impossible expeditions. Like the video, it helps more than people realize. And in the comments, tell me, what country are you watching from right now? I read them, and I want to know how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the night Everest decided to look back. The first time I realized Everest had its own kind of silence, it wasn't at base camp. Base camp was noisy. Generator hum, stoves hissing, radios crackling, laughter that sounded too loud because everyone was trying to convince themselves they belonged there. The real silence began higher, where sound didn't travel the way it should. We were at Camp 2, tucked into a shallow bowl of rock and ice above the western CWM, a place climbers called the Valley of Silence. During the day, the sun turned it into an oven. At night, it became a freezer that swallowed breath. The air was so thin that every conversation sounded delayed, like the mountain was deciding whether to let your words exist. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 38, a documentary cameraman with more miles in my boots than sense in my optimism. I'd filmed storms in the North Atlantic, wildfires in California, and conflict zones where gunfire stitched the sky. But none of that prepared me for the way altitude makes fear feel logical. Our expedition leader was Graham Holt, 56, British, calm to the point of irritating. He'd summited Everest twice, turned back 3 times, and had a face that looked carved from old rope. People trusted him because he never raised his voice. We had 2 Sherpa guides, Tenzing and Pasang. They didn't waste words. When they spoke, it was usually to warn us about something we couldn't see. Then there was the rest of the team. Asha Verma, a high-altitude climber from India, with a quiet intensity and an almost academic approach to risk. And Milo Grant, our sound engineer, who joked constantly like humor, could keep his lungs inflated. We were there to film a feature-length expedition documentary, Everest, Nightline. A title the producers loved because it sounded clean and heroic. The truth was messier. We wanted the first extended night sequence filmed above Camp 2 with professional cinema gear. Climbers moving by headlamp, the Milky Way arcing over the Lhotse face, the whole mountain glowing like a myth. It took us days to haul the equipment up. Cameras, lenses, a stabilized gimbal that might as well have been made of gold, and batteries we treated like medicine. In sub-zero temperatures, lithium dies fast. We kept spares against our bodies, wrapped in down and plastic, like fragile eggs. On the afternoon we planned to shoot, the weather looked almost kind. Wind low, clear sky, a ribbon of cloud far above the summit like smoke from a distant fire. Graham didn't smile. "Everest is being polite," he said. "That's usually when it's most dangerous." We began setting up just before dusk. The snow around Camp 2 was packed hard by countless expeditions. Beyond the tents, the world dropped away into a cold blue abyss. I chose a ridgeline where I could frame the slope with the glacier in the foreground and the black wall of Lhotse rising behind it. The shot would be perfect. Headlamps tracing a slow line upward, stars sharp enough to cut. Milo set microphones near the camp, protected in windshields, hoping to catch the clean sound of crampons biting ice. Asha checked everyone's harnesses and carabiners like she didn't trust anyone to survive without her approval. Tenzing watched the horizon. He did that a lot, as if the sky owed him something. Pasang came up beside me while I tightened the tripod legs into the snow. He pointed at my lens with a gloved finger. "You keep it covered," he said. "I will," I replied, thinking he meant spindrift. He shook his head once. "Not snow." Then he walked away. That was the first small crack in my confidence, the first moment where a superstition slipped under the door. By full dark, Camp 2 looked like a scattered constellation, tents glowing faintly from headlamps inside, tiny points of light moving between them. The temperature dropped so fast my eyelashes crusted with ice whenever I exhaled too hard. I turned on the main camera, checked exposure, and watched the screen bloom with a night image that looked impossibly crisp. The stars were there, pinned in black velvet. The mountain was a jagged shadow. Our headlamps looked like drifting comets. "Rolling," I said into the radio. Milo answered. "Audio rolling." Asha's voice came next. "Climbers moving in 30 seconds. We weren't doing a full push toward Camp 3 that night, just a controlled climb segment for film. We'd go up a few hundred meters, capture the sequence, then return before our oxygen debt became a problem. I watched through the viewfinder as Asha and Graham stepped onto the slope, their headlamps angled down so they wouldn't blind each other. The light beams cut through air so clear it almost looked solid, then the wind died. It wasn't dramatic at first because the mountain always breathed in strange ways. But there's a difference between wind easing and wind stopping. One is a natural shift. The other feels like being noticed. The flapping tent lines went slack. The faint hiss of air past rock vanished. Even the small clink of metal sounded too loud. Milo's voice came over the radio, lower than before. "You hear that?" "Hear what?" I asked. "Exactly." I didn't answer because I understood. I kept filming. The camera's screen was my whole world, framed, controlled, predictable, and then movement appeared in the upper left of the image. At first I thought it was a trick of the sensor. High ISO can paint ghosts into darkness, but this wasn't static. It was a smooth shift, something crossing a slope far above our climbers, beyond the reach of our headlamps. I leaned closer until my breath fogged the viewfinder. The shape was tall, darker than the night around it, like a hole moving through space. It moved across the snow without the jerky rhythm of a climber. No pauses, no testing footholds, no stumble. And it didn't sink. The most unsettling detail was the lack of displacement. Anyone up there, even with perfect technique, leaves a trail. But the snow under this figure looked untouched. No spray, no sag, no crumble. I swallowed hard. "Graham," I said into the radio, trying to keep my tone casual, "do you have visual on anything above you?" "Static." Then his voice. "No. Why?" I didn't want to say it. Saying it makes it real. "Just thought I saw movement. Might be a climber from another team," Asha answered before Graham could. "No teams above us tonight." My gloved hand tightened around the camera grip. "Could be someone descending late." "Not from there," she said. "That line is wrong." I zoomed in. The image tightened, pixel noise increasing, but the shape became clearer. It wasn't bulky like a climber in down gear. It was narrow in a way that made my brain itch. The proportions were off. Long limbs. A torso that didn't sway with steps. It crossed the slope and then, without warning, stopped. And it turned, not toward the route, toward the lens. In that instant, every hair on my body tried to lift under layers of wool and down. It was ridiculous, irrational, but my reaction wasn't a thought. It was an ancient reflex, prey noticing a predator, noticing it back. I pulled my face away from the viewfinder and looked with my own eyes into the darkness. I saw nothing, just the mountain and the stars and the faint glow of headlamps below. But the screen still showed it. It stood there, motionless, angled slightly as if listening. Milo's breathing came across the radio. "Danny, what are you seeing?" "I don't know," I whispered, and my voice sounded small even to me. The figure moved again, but not across the slope this time. It moved downward, directly along the line of the camera's sight, like it had chosen a path toward us. My stomach clenched. It wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. It moved with certainty. Graham's voice cut in sharply. "Daniel, stop filming and pack up." I stared at the screen. "We can't. This is the shot." "Pack up," he repeated, and I'd never heard fear in his voice before. I snapped my eyes from the screen to the ridge above Camp 2. Still nothing, but the camera showed it closer now, not by much, but enough that the shape filled more of the frame. The wind stayed dead. Tenzing appeared beside me like he'd been standing in my blind spot all along. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at my face. "You saw," he said, not as a question. My mouth was dry. "What is it?" His expression didn't change. "Not for camera." "Not human?" I forced out. He didn't answer that either. He only reached forward and pressed 2 fingers to the lens hood, lowering it gently like you would close a child's eyes. "No more," he said. "We go inside." Now. I should have listened immediately. Instead, I did what cameramen always do when the impossible is happening. I rolled longer. The figure continued its approach. Still no trail, still no sound. The headlamps below kept moving, unaware, while the thing above them slid through the night like it belonged there. Asha's voice came over the radio again, tight. "Graham, I feel something, like pressure." "Turn back," Graham said. "Now." I saw their headlamps pivot in my frame, the two climbers starting to descend toward camp. The beams swung, briefly washing over the slope. For half a second, their light brushed the area where the figure stood. The screen flared white for a heartbeat. And the shape vanished, not stepped away, not blended into shadow. It was simply gone. My pulse hammered so hard I worried I'd vomit inside my balaclava. Milo's voice came through like a prayer. "Tell me you got that." "I got something," I said, but the words didn't comfort me, because the moment it disappeared, the wind returned. It came back with a sudden rush, like the mountain exhaled after holding its breath. Tent fabric snapped, ice crystals lifted and danced. And over the wind, faint but unmistakable, the radio picked up a new sound. A low, dragging scrape, not through the microphone near the tents, through Graham's mic, clipped to his chest, still out on the slope as he descended. "Graham," I said, "what's that noise?" His breathing was heavy, faster than it should have been. "Keep moving," he muttered, not answering me directly. The scrape came again, closer this time. Asha's voice cracked. "Something is behind us." My throat tightened. I stared into the darkness beyond the camera. Still nothing, but the scrape continued, a steady rhythm like something being pulled over ice, not footsteps, not crampons, more like weight. Then Graham's mic popped with a sudden sharp sound, like fabric tearing, and his voice exploded into the radio. "Run!" The headlamps in my frame lurched, their beams bouncing wildly as both climbers broke into a desperate downhill scramble. Training disappears fast in the death zone. Fear replaces technique. I tore the camera off the tripod so hard the legs half collapsed, slung it against my chest, and stumbled toward the nearest tent. Tenzing grabbed my shoulder, hard enough to bruise through layers. "No outside," he hissed. "Inside!" We dove into the main mess tent, Milo right behind us, fumbling the zipper with shaking hands. Pasang was already inside, his eyes wide and alert. Graham and Asha burst in seconds later, dragging Snow and Panic with them. Graham slammed the flap closed and leaned his weight against the entrance as if expecting something to shove through. For a moment, no one spoke. Only our breathing filled the cramped space, 6 people sucking thin air like drowning victims. Then Milo whispered the question none of us wanted to hear out loud. "Did it follow you?" Asha's face was pale under frost. She stared at her gloves as if she expected blood. "I didn't see it," she said, "but I felt the space behind me change. Like the mountain got closer." Graham kept his back against the entrance. His eyes flicked to the radio, then to me, then away. "What did you see on the camera?" he asked. I hesitated, saying it would lock it into the world. "Taller than a person," I said finally, "moving without sinking." It turned toward the lens. Tenzing made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh. Pasang muttered something in Sherpa, fast and sharp, and Tenzing answered him with a single sentence that sounded like a warning. Milo looked between them. "What did he say?" Tenzing's gaze stayed fixed on the tent wall, as if he refused to look toward the mountain. "He says, the old stories are not stories." Graham swallowed. "We're not here to chase folklore." Tenzing finally looked at him. "Then don't film at night." My hands were shaking as I checked the camera body. Still intact. Still recording time code. I stopped the clip. The silence after I hit stop felt like a betrayal. Outside, the wind rose again, howling down the valley. Snow hissed against the tent fabric like sand. We stayed like that for nearly an hour, not daring to open the flap, not daring to say what we were thinking, that something had been close enough to breathe on our backs. And now it knew exactly where we were. Eventually, Graham spoke, voice controlled but strained. "We're changing the plan," he said. "No more night filming above Camp 2. We stay conservative. We get our footage in daylight. We don't—" A sudden impact hit the tent wall. Not hard enough to collapse it, hard enough to make every one of us freeze. It wasn't wind. Wind pushes and flutters. This was a single, deliberate thud. Then another, lighter this time, almost like a test. Milo's eyes widened. "Please tell me that's spindrift." Tenzing didn't move. His hand drifted toward the small knife clipped inside his jacket, a useless gesture against whatever might be outside. The tent wall pressed inward slightly, as if something leaned close. No sound of breathing, no voice, just the fabric stretching. And then, very softly, a new sound threaded through the storm, a faint clicking, like stones tapped together, or teeth. Graham's voice dropped to a whisper. "Nobody moves." The clicking came again, slow and patient, traveling along the tent wall, left to right, like whatever it was circling, learning the shape of our shelter. My mind ran wild with explanations, a loose carabiner, an ice chunk, a stray piece of gear, but each explanation died under the weight of what we'd seen on the screen. Then it stopped. The pressure on the fabric eased. Silence returned. Not the normal silence, but the held breath silence from earlier. And from outside, a sound rose that made my blood go cold. A long, low exhale, too deep to be wind, too controlled to be an animal. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a scream. It was a breath. Right beside the tent flap, Asher's hand found mine in the dark, gripping so tight it hurt. Then the breath withdrew, and the wind returned like nothing had happened. For a long time, none of us spoke. Finally, Milo whispered, voice trembling, "Danny, did you capture any of that?" I looked down at my camera. My fingers were numb, but I could still feel the cold metal. "I don't know," I said. "But if I did, we're going to wish I hadn't." Outside, Everest kept howling, and the darkness beyond our thin fabric walls felt less like night and more like a living thing waiting for us to make a mistake. And deep inside me, a terrible certainty formed. Quiet. Absolute. The mountain hadn't shown us something by accident. It had warned us, and we still had to climb higher. By morning, the storm had scrubbed the sky clean. Light poured into the western CWM like molten glass, making the snow so bright it hurt to look at. The Valley of Silence returned to its usual lie, peaceful, harmless, almost inviting, like the night before had been a bad dream brought on by thin air and too much fear. But no one joked at breakfast. We sat hunched inside the mess tent with cups of tea that cooled too fast, listening to the distant groan of the glacier and the occasional snap of ice shifting under pressure. Graham's hands were steady as he checked the weather printouts and radio reports, but his eyes kept drifting to the camera case at my feet, as if that black box had become another team member, one he didn't trust. Milo finally broke first. "We need to back up the footage," he said, voice careful. "If it's real, It's not a ghost story," Graham cut in. Asher didn't look up from her gloves. "You're not answering him." Graham exhaled through his nose, like he was trying not to show irritation. "I'm answering the situation. We don't chase shadows at altitude. We finish acclimatization. We keep daylight operations, and we stay inside our margins." Tenzing and Pasang listened without comment. When Sherpa are silent, it's rarely agreement. It's calculation. I unzipped the camera case and pulled out the memory cards with fingers that still felt clumsy from cold. The cards were tiny, absurdly fragile, considering what they held. Milo leaned in, eyes hungry for proof. He wanted to hear what he'd recorded. He wanted the world to hear it. Graham stopped him with a single look. "Not here," he said. "Not until we're stable." That was the compromise. We'd keep moving with the expedition schedule, but the footage stayed locked away until we were lower, more rational, less vulnerable to panic. The mountain didn't care about our compromises. Outside, we watched other teams prepare. You could always tell the inexperienced climbers, too much gear hanging, too much talking, too much optimism. The veterans moved like they were already tired, because they knew the mountain collects energy like interest. You pay for every step. We planned a daylight carry toward Camp Third that day, a short push up the lower part of the Lhotse face, just enough to stash equipment and let our bodies taste the next altitude. It was standard, safe, controlled. And yet when we stepped out, I felt it immediately. The atmosphere had changed, not the weather, not the visibility, something more subtle, like the air itself was watching for us to repeat last night's mistake. We roped up after noon. The sun was brutal, reflecting off the snow until everything looked unreal, like a set built for a film. My boots crunched and squealed against hard ice. My pack felt heavier than it should, because altitude turns every kilo into a moral decision. Graham led. Asher followed. Then Tenzing, me, Milo and Pasang bringing up the rear. The fixed lines glimmered ahead, disappearing into the steep blue wall of the face. In the distance, tiny figures moved like insects on a white sheet. "This is real," Milo muttered behind me. "This is what I signed up for." I wanted to answer with something calming. Instead, I kept scanning the slope above, trying not to. The worst part wasn't what I saw. It was what I expected. We reached the first steep section and clipped into the fixed line. My breath came sharp and thin, like it was being stolen before it reached my lungs. Every few minutes we stopped, not because we wanted to, but because our bodies demanded it. Halfway through a rest, I noticed something near a rock outcrop, a bright scrap of fabric fluttering slightly, caught under a ridge of ice. At first I assumed it was trash. There's more of that on Everest than anyone likes to admit. But as I stepped closer, I saw the pattern. A high-end down suit sleeve torn clean off. The stitching was ripped, not cut. One side was crusted with ice like it had been there overnight. "Graham," I called, keeping my voice level. "We've got gear." He came back down a few steps, squinting. "From another team," he said immediately, almost reflexively. Asha crouched, touching the fabric with her glove. "It's fresh." Milo pointed upslope. "There are climbers above. Maybe someone ditched weight." Tenzing didn't kneel. He looked at the tier, then at the line above us, then at the sky. His jaw tightened. "Not ditch," he said. "Pull." The word landed heavy. Graham's eyes narrowed. "Pull from what?" Tenzing didn't answer. He just stood, as if that was enough, as if he'd said the only part that mattered. We left the sleeve where it was. No one wanted to carry it, and none of us wanted to ask too many questions. But as we started moving again, I felt the team's rhythm tighten. Fewer jokes. Shorter radio checks. Our ropes seemed less like safety and more like a leash. Around the next bulge of ice, we encountered something else, a set of tracks crossing the slope at an angle, half filled with spindrift. They weren't crampon prints. They weren't snowshoes either. Too narrow, too deep in the wrong places. Asha leaned close, eyes scanning like she was solving a puzzle. "Could be a boot with a broken spike pattern," Milo offered. Asha shook her head slowly. "Look at the spacing." The steps were long enough that a human would have to be running or bounding in a way that made no sense on that gradient. And yet there were no signs of slipping, no frantic gouges in the snow. It was as if whatever made them didn't fear falling. Graham stared for one long second, then forced his voice into command tone. "We're not tracking, we're moving." But as we moved, I noticed something I wish I hadn't. The tracks didn't go up. They went across, and then stopped at a patch of hard, wind-polished ice, like the maker had stepped onto glass and vanished. We pushed higher anyway, because that's what climbers do when they don't know what else to do. Keep moving. Keep the blood flowing. Pretend the mountain's warnings are just patterns in snow. At around 23,000 feet, the sun began to slide behind the ridges, and shadows stretched long. We reached our stash point near the lower edge of where Camp 3 would sit, a place already marked by old anchors and faded tape fluttering like surrender flags. Graham signaled for a stop. 10 minutes, he said. Drink, eat, then we go down. I unclipped the camera and filmed a few seconds of the face in daylight. Safe shots, sensible shots. I kept the lens low, away from the sky above us. A ridiculous precaution, except none of us laughed. Milo was chewing slowly, forcing calories down. "When we get back," he said quietly, "we listen to last night's audio." Graham didn't respond. Asha's gaze was fixed on something upslope. "There's a climber above," she said. Graham followed her line of sight. "That's normal." "No," she replied. "He's not moving." We all stared. A figure was clipped to the fixed line far above, maybe 150 meters. At first, I couldn't tell if they were resting, taking a breath. But then the stillness became wrong. Too still. Tenzing raised his binoculars, looked and lowered them quickly. "Not good," he said. Graham's face hardened. "We're not doing a rescue at this altitude with this gear. We notify base and—" Asha was already moving. "If that's a person, they're dying." Graham grabbed her shoulder. "Asha," she shrugged him off. "You're the leader. Lead." It took only seconds for the argument to die, because the mountain doesn't wait for ethics debates. Graham cursed under his breath, signaled Pasang, and we began the slow, punishing climb toward the motionless figure. Each step felt like hauling my own body through syrup. My heart thudded against my ribs like it wanted out. The air burned cold in my throat. As we got closer, details emerged. The climber's head was slumped, one glove was missing. The oxygen line dangled loose, flapping gently. Graham stopped 10 meters below and clipped in, secure. "Hello," he shouted. No response. Asha climbed the last meters, reaching out carefully, voice steady but urgent. "Can you hear me?" Still nothing. She touched the climber's shoulder. The body shifted slightly with the contact, and I felt my stomach drop, not because of the dead weight, but because the suit was torn at the back, as if something had grabbed and pulled. Asha's eyes widened. She didn't say a word. Graham climbed up, his calm cracking at the edges. He reached around to check the climber's face, then froze. "This isn't—" he started. Milo's voice came strained from below. "What is it?" Graham swallowed hard. "There's no face." The words didn't compute. My mind tried to translate them into something sensible. Frostbite, mask, ice. But Graham didn't sound confused. He sounded certain. I climbed another few meters until I could see. The climber's hood was open, rimmed with frost. Inside was darkness and ice, and the vague shape of something that should have been a head. But there were no features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a hollow, frozen cavity, like the inside of a broken helmet, except this was skin and fabric, not plastic. The edges were ragged, not cut cleanly, and the suit's collar was torn as if whatever happened had happened fast. Milo gagged behind me, the sound muffled by his mask. Asha whispered almost to herself, "That's impossible." Tenzing spoke, low. "We go down." Graham's hands trembled as he clipped the body more securely to the line, an instinctive act of respect, or maybe guilt. Then his eyes snapped to the slope above us. He wasn't looking for more climbers. He was looking for something else. We began descending immediately, but the mountain had decided to add one more detail. As we moved down, my radio hissed with static, then a burst of voices, overlapping, distorted, too fast. It sounded like someone speaking close to the mic, but the words were scrambled, stretched, wrong. Milo slapped his radio. "Interference. Solar, maybe." Then the static cleared for a second, and a voice came through, quiet, calm, and not one of ours. "Turn the camera back on." I froze so hard my crampons bit deep. Asha looked at me. "Did you hear that?" Graham barked. "Keep moving." But my hands had already drifted to the camera strapped to my chest, like my body was obeying the voice before my brain could stop it. Milo's eyes were wide with terror. That was on my channel. That voice was on my channel. The radio crackled again. "Turn it back on." Tenzing grabbed Milo's radio and ripped the battery out with a decisive motion, as if cutting a fuse. The sudden silence in our comms felt like stepping underwater. We descended in grim focus. The glacier below looked miles away. The tents of Camp 2 were tiny dots in a sea of white. My thighs burned, my lungs felt bruised, and all the while the thought gnawed at me. How did a voice get onto our channel up here, in this emptiness, speaking in perfect English, with no accent at all? By the time we stumbled back into Camp 2, the light was fading again. The mountain's shadows were stretching into the bowl, reaching like fingers. Nobody wanted another night. Inside the mess tent, Graham spoke first, voice harsh. "We report the body to base. We do not talk about the condition. We say unrecoverable, severe trauma, unknown cause." Milo threw his gloves down. "Unknown cause? His face is gone." Graham's eyes flashed. "You want panic? You want other teams climbing blind because they think there's a monster on the face? You want Sherpa refusing to work? This isn't a campfire story, Milo. This is a high-altitude operation with real consequences." Dasha's voice was softer, but it cut deeper. "So what do you think it is?" Graham didn't answer. He looked at Tenzing. Tenzing's expression was unreadable. "Some places have guardians," he said finally. "Everest is not just rock." Milo's lips trembled. "Then why do people climb it?" Pasang spoke for the first time in a long while, his English blunt. "Because they think mountain belongs to them." Silence. I pulled the memory cards from my camera again, staring at them like they were radioactive. The night footage was one thing, but now there was the voice on the radio, and the climber with the impossible injury, and the torn sleeve below. Pieces were connecting into a picture I didn't want. Graham made the call to base camp, keeping his words controlled, clinical. He didn't mention the missing face. He didn't mention the tracks. He didn't mention the radio. When he finished, he sat with his elbows on his knees and rubbed his forehead like an old man. "We descend tomorrow," he said, and for a moment I thought he meant all the way down. I felt relief so sharp it almost made me dizzy, but then he added, "To Camp I, we regroup, we wait for a weather window, and then we continue the schedule." Asher stared at him. "Continue? After this?" Graham's eyes were bloodshot with fatigue. "We have contracts. We have permits. We have a team depending on this expedition for income. We're not making decisions based on fear and half-seen shadows." Milo's voice rose. "You're making decisions based on money." Graham stood abruptly, rage and fear finally breaking through his calm. "I'm making decisions based on reality. Reality is, you don't hallucinate torn suits and dead climbers. Reality is, we don't survive if we fall apart." He pointed at my camera. "And you, Daniel, lock that footage away. If you watch it up here in this thin air, it will crawl into your mind and stay there." I should have listened. But later, when everyone was in their tents and the wind began to rise again, I lay awake with my heart thumping and the memory cards in my pocket like stolen evidence. The darkness outside pressed against the fabric, patient as a hunter. I told myself I only wanted to confirm what I'd captured, to reassure myself it was sensor noise, a trick of the night, to prove the voice on the radio hadn't been real. I slipped the camera out, hands shaking, and crawled into the empty mess tent where I could see the screen without anyone watching me. My breath fogged the viewfinder as I loaded the card and scrolled to the clip. The first frames were normal. Stars, headlamps, the ridge, then the movement. There it was, undeniable. The tall shape crossing snow like it weighed nothing. My pulse hammered as I advanced frame by frame. When it turned toward the lens, the image sharpened for a fraction of a second, just enough for the camera sensor to catch a detail my eyes never had. Something in the darkness where a face should be. Not a human face. A smooth, pale surface, like ice under skin, with a line where a mouth might be, too wide, too still, opening slightly as if tasting the air. And then, in the audio track, buried under wind and my own breathing, there was a sound I hadn't noticed before. A faint clicking, right beside the microphone. Inside the tent behind me, the fabric shifted, barely audible. I froze. the screen still glowing in my hands, and realized with sudden horror that I wasn't alone in the mess tent anymore. I didn't move. The camera screen lit my gloves and the inside of the mess tent in a weak blue glow. Everything outside that glow felt thicker, heavier, like darkness with weight. The audio waveform on the display continued to crawl forward, and beneath the wind, beneath my own shallow breathing, that clicking persisted, soft, deliberate, too close to be from the slope. The tent fabric shifted again behind me. Not a gust, not a flutter, a slow inward press, as if something had leaned its body against the wall to test how much it would give. My instincts screamed to whip around and confront it, but altitude does strange things to courage. It turns bravery into calculation. If I looked and saw nothing, I'd blame myself and keep spiraling. If I looked and saw something, I didn't know what I'd do with that truth. So I did what fear makes people do when they can't fight. I tried to make it not real. "Pasang," I called, forcing my voice to sound normal. "That you?" No answer. The clicking stopped. The silence that replaced it felt sharper than sound. Then, very softly, a new noise came, almost like a wet inhale through a narrow opening. Not loud, not dramatic. Controlled. Curious, it wasn't the wind. I slid the camera down toward my chest, as if hiding it would hide me. My hand found the zipper of the tent flap, but my fingers were numb and clumsy. The zipper didn't budge at first. I pulled harder. Outside the flap, a shadow crossed the fabric, tall and narrow, blotting out the faint starlight. My stomach lurched. The shadow didn't move like a person walking past. It moved like something drifting, the way a cloud moves when it passes in front of the moon. Smooth, certain. Too close. I stopped breathing without meaning to. The shadow paused right at the entrance. A faint click, closer now, right beside the zipper. The flap trembled once, as if a hand had brushed it. I yanked the zipper. The teeth screamed in the cold. The sound felt loud enough to alert the whole mountain. The moment the opening widened, a blast of freezing air poured in, and I spilled out of the tent on hands and knees, dragging the camera with me. The night hit my face like a slap. I looked up, scanning for movement, anything. There was nothing. No figure, no outline, no shape against the snow, only the tents, the stars, and the fixed lines disappearing into darkness. My headlamp beam sliced over the ground near the mess tent. No footprints, not even a scuff. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling toward Graham's tent like a drunk, and slapped the fabric hard. "Graham!" I hissed. "Graham, wake up!" Inside, a startled curse. The zipper rattled. Graham's face appeared, pale and irritated. Then he saw mine, and the irritation vanished. "What happened?" he demanded. "I was in the mess tent, watching the footage. Something was there." He stared at me for a long second, weighing whether altitude had broken my mind. "Describe it." "Dacht," I said without thinking. Pressure. The wall moved. I heard clicking. My voice cracked. It was right at the flap. Graham stepped out, pulling on gloves. His eyes flicked to the mess tent, then to the darkness beyond it. "You woke anyone else?" "No." He didn't like that, but there wasn't time for blame. He moved with purpose now, shaking Asher awake, then Milo, then Tenzing and Pasang. In under 2 minutes, we stood together outside the mess tent, headlamps off, listening. The wind had dropped again. The silence returned, the same unnatural, held-breath quiet that made the back of my neck prickle. Tenzing leaned close to Graham. "No, go inside," he said. Graham ignored him and reached for the mess tent zipper. Pasang caught his wrist. Not violent, firm. "Bad," Pasang said simply. Graham's jaw tightened. "We're not children." Tenzing's eyes cut toward me. "He already go inside. Nothing good." Asha's voice was calm, but her hands were shaking. "We don't need to prove anything. We need to survive." Milo swallowed hard. "What if it's just ice settling?" I wanted to believe that. I needed it. Graham took his wrist back from Pasang and opened the flap just enough to shine a narrow beam inside. The mess tent interior looked exactly as we left it. Mats, stove, a hanging lantern, the supply bag stacked along the edge. Except the camera, my camera, was no longer on the mat where I'd set it down as I crawled out. It lay deeper inside the tent near the far wall, angled upward, as if someone had placed it carefully to look back at the entrance. My throat tightened. Graham stared at it for a full 3 seconds. Then he closed the flap slowly, almost respectfully. No one spoke. The wind returned in a sudden gust, snapping tent lines. The mountain exhaled. The moment passed like a fever breaking, leaving only exhaustion and the taste of panic. Graham turned to me, voice low. "You don't go into an empty tent alone again, understand?" I nodded. He looked at Milo and Asha next. "At first light we descend to Camp Y. No discussion. We don't linger." Tenzing didn't look relieved. He looked resigned, like a man who knows leaving isn't the same as escaping. When dawn came, it came brutally, blue-white light spilling across the western CWM, revealing everything and explaining nothing. The mountain looked innocent again. Our fear looked childish in daylight. But the camera's new position inside the mess tent wasn't a hallucination. We all saw it. And when I checked the camera, my hands trembling, I found something that made my skin go cold. A new clip, recorded after I had hit stop. A file with a timestamp that made no sense, because it began 2 minutes after I ran out of the tent. I didn't tell Graham immediately. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't, because I was terrified of what I'd see when I played it. We packed quickly, roped up, and began the descent toward Camp Y. The route meant dropping down through the western CWM, then facing the Khumbu icefall, an unstable maze of crevasses and towering blocks of ice that shift and crack like a living thing. In daylight it's terrifying. With fear already riding our shoulders, it felt like walking into the throat of an animal. The icefall greeted us with its usual noises, distant booms like artillery, the slow groan of pressure deep in the glacier. Ladders spanned gaps that looked bottomless. Fixed ropes hung taut over blue ice walls. We moved carefully, one at a time, over the ladders, clipping and unclipping, concentrating so hard on each step that there was no room for imagination. For a while, it worked. Then, halfway through a ladder crossing over a crevasse wide enough to swallow a bus, Milo froze. His boot stopped on the rung. His gloved hand tightened on the rope. "What is it?" Asha called from the other side. Milo's voice came thin. "Do you hear that?" I listened. At first, I heard only the icefall, wind, creaking, distant cracks. Then it came again. Click, click, click. Not from above, not from the glacier beneath. From somewhere near the ladder, close enough that it seemed to vibrate through the metal. Milo's breathing escalated. "It's right," he swallowed. "It's right here. Move!" Graham snapped, harsh now, no patience left. "Move, Milo!" Milo tried, but fear locked him. His boot slipped half an inch, and the ladder wobbled. My heart slammed. I stepped closer on my side, clipping in and leaned forward. "Milo, look at me," I said. "Just my voice. Don't look down. One step at a time." He nodded barely. Behind him the clicking stopped. The sudden silence was worse. Milo forced one step, then another. The ladder steadied. We got him across, and he collapsed onto the ice like a man who'd crawled out of water. Graham grabbed his jacket. "You don't freeze out here," he hissed. "Freezing kills all of us." Milo's eyes were huge. "I heard it," he whispered. "I swear to God I heard it." Tenzing scanned the ice walls around us, his face tight. "No stop," he said. "No stop now." We pushed on. But as we moved, I began noticing small details I hadn't wanted to notice. Shallow marks on wind-polished ice that looked like long steps. A section of rope that had been rubbed raw, as if something heavy had brushed past. A set of ladder rungs with a strange smear across them. Dark, not blood, more like wet ash. Then, as we reached a narrow corridor between two seracs, the icefall boomed. A deep, cracking report that punched through my chest. Everyone dropped instinctively, bracing for collapse. Ice dust drifted like fog. We waited. Nothing fell. The corridor held. Graham raised his head first, eyes scanning. "Move!" he said, but his voice had lost some conviction. Asha crawled forward, then froze. She pointed with a trembling glove. Across the corridor, on a high shelf of ice, maybe 30 feet above us, something stood in shadow, not fully visible, but tall enough that it shouldn't have fit there comfortably. Still, motionless, like it had been waiting for us to look up. My mouth went dry. I lifted the camera without thinking, the lens searching for it. The moment the frame settled, the figure shifted, not stepping, not climbing, just sliding backward into darkness until the shelf was empty. Graham's voice went tight. "We didn't see anything." Asha stared at him. "We just did." "No," he said, and the word was a command meant for all of us, not just her. "We don't feed this." We moved like hunted animals after that, fast and disciplined, not speaking unless necessary. The icefall felt narrower, more claustrophobic. Every crack sounded like pursuit. Every gust of wind felt like breath at our backs. When we finally reached Camp 1, the relief wasn't joy. It was the numb relief of people who made it out of something and don't want to talk about what it cost. Camp, I was busy. Tents clustered on the lower glacier, teams resting, Sherpa hauling loads, the usual choreography of Everest, normal life, normal problems. And yet, the moment we arrived, a sirdar from another team approached Graham with a grim face and low voice. Asha translated parts of the Nepali and English mix. "They lost a climber last night, above Camp 2. Radio went strange. Then silence." Graham's shoulders stiffened. "Which team?" The sirdar said the name. I didn't recognize it, but the fear in his eyes was universal. Milo leaned toward me, whispering, "So we're not crazy." I wanted that confirmation, but it didn't feel like comfort. It felt like a door closing. That evening, with daylight fading and the camp settling into its routine, I couldn't hold it anymore. I waited until Graham was checking gear, until Milo was busy in his tent, until Asha was out speaking with another climber about the missing man. Then I sat alone in my tent, zip tight, headlamp low, and loaded the camera's newest clip. My hands shook so badly I had to restart twice. The file opened. At first, it showed the mess tent from a low angle, exactly where we'd found the camera, aimed toward the entrance. The image was steady, unnaturally steady, as if the camera had been placed by someone who knew framing. The flap moved slightly, reacting to wind. Then, in the audio track, the clicking began. Slow, close. The flap bulged inward, and a silhouette filled the opening, not entering, not pushing through, just blocking the starlight so completely that the tent interior dimmed. The figure leaned down. It didn't have the clumsy bend of a human in heavy gear. It moved like something flexible, jointed in ways I couldn't map. A pale surface emerged where a face might be, smooth, reflective like ice beneath skin. It hovered inches from the lens. And then, clear as my own voice, the audio captured a whisper, not through radio static, not distorted. A whisper inside the tent. "Bring it higher." My blood turned cold. The figure's head tilted as if listening for my reaction, even though I wasn't there anymore. Then it withdrew, the flap settling back into place. The last seconds of the clip showed nothing but darkness, and the hanging lantern swaying slightly, as if someone had brushed past it. I sat there staring at the screen until the file ended, until the camera displayed the next thumbnail, until my headlamp buzzed faintly. "Bring it higher," I whispered back, tasting the words like poison. Because now it wasn't a mystery in the snow, or a shadow on a ridge, or a voice bleeding into radio channels. Now it was something that had entered our space, something that understood the camera, something that wanted us to keep climbing. Outside my tent, Campai murmured with normal human sounds, zippers, stoves, distant laughter, the world acting as if nothing was wrong. I forced myself to breathe, to think like a rational person. I should show Graham, but the moment I imagined it, I saw his face, hardening, shutting down, choosing denial for the sake of control. And if he denied it, I'd be alone with it again. A soft knock came on my tent wall. Once. Gentle. I froze. The knock came again, same rhythm, polite, almost human. "Daniel?" Asha's voice muffled through fabric. My chest loosened with relief so intense it nearly made me dizzy. I fumbled the zipper open a few inches. Asha crouched outside, headlamp angled down. "Graham wants a meeting," she said. Her eyes flicked to my face. "Are you okay?" I hesitated. "Yeah, just tired." She studied me like she didn't believe it, then nodded. "Come." I shut the camera off, slid the memory cards into the deepest pocket of my jacket, and stepped out into the cold. As I followed her toward the mess tent, I glanced back at my own tent. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow behind the fabric, tall and narrow, as if someone stood inside, perfectly still. Then a gust hit, the fabric rippled, and it was gone. Asha was already walking ahead, and the camp lights bobbed like harmless fireflies. But deep in my pocket, the memory cards felt heavier than they should have, like a weight that wanted to be carried upward. And as the last light drained from the ice, the radio on a nearby tent crackled once. No words, just a soft burst of static, followed by a faint clicking that sounded like teeth tapping together in the dark. Graham called the meeting inside the crowded mess tent at Camp Y, where the air smelled of fuel, sweat, and the sharp metallic bite of cold. Around us, other teams moved in and out, talking in low voices, pretending not to listen. But news travels fast on Everest, and by then everyone had heard about the missing climber above Camp 2. In a place where death is common, uncertainty is what truly spreads panic. Graham kept his voice controlled, the way a seasoned leader speaks when he wants fear to stay seated. "We rotate back up tomorrow," he said. "We return to Camp 2, rest, then make a daylight carry toward Camp 3 if conditions hold. No night filming, no exceptions." Milo stared at him like he'd misheard. "We're going back up?" "We're acclimatizing," Graham answered. "If we stop now, our bodies deacclimatize, our permit window closes, and we leave the mountain with nothing but paranoia." Asha's eyes were steady on Graham. "And the footage?" Graham's jaw tightened. "It stays sealed." I felt the memory cards in my pocket like a second heartbeat. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. I could have ended the argument by showing them the new clip, but I knew what it would do. It would turn a tense team into a fractured one, and fractures at altitude don't heal, they widen. Tenzing and Pasang said little, but their silence felt like a warning. They weren't debating whether we should climb. They were measuring how quickly this could turn fatal. After the meeting, Asha walked with me outside, away from the tents where people could overhear. She didn't speak for a long moment, just watched the ice fall in the distance, the jagged maze rising toward the dark shoulder of the mountain. "You didn't sleep," she said finally. I tried to shrug, but it came out stiff. "None of us did." Asha turned her gaze on me. "Daniel, you saw more than you've said." It wasn't a question. It was a diagnosis. I hesitated too long, and she nodded once, as if that confirmed everything. "If you're carrying something alone up here," she said, "it will poison you." I wanted to tell her. I wanted the relief of confession. But the words that came out were smaller, weaker. "I'm fine." Asha studied my face like she was deciding how hard to push. Then she said, "Tomorrow, we move through the icefall before dawn. That means darkness. If you start seeing things, don't run off alone again." I forced a thin smile. "I'll be attached to a rope. I can't run." "That's not what I meant," she replied. That night, the temperature dropped so low my breath felt like glass. I lay inside my tent, listening to the camp settle, and tried to convince myself that exhaustion had turned the world into a nightmare. But whenever I closed my eyes, I saw the clip again. The figure leaning toward my lens, whispering like it belonged in human space. "Bring it higher." It sounded less like a threat and more like an instruction someone expects you to obey. We left Camp 1 at 2:30 a.m. Headlamps dimmed, bodies slow from cold and altitude. That was normal. Icefall crossings happen early because cold stabilizes the glacier, because the sun loosens it and turns it into a shifting trap. Every climber knows that. Every climber also knows that stabilizes is a relative word. The icefall is never safe. It's just sometimes less eager to kill you. The first hour was quiet. Only the rhythm of breath and the crunch of crampons. Ladders glinted faintly ahead, bridges over voids that swallowed headlamp beams. Fixed ropes hummed with tension. The ice walls rose on either side like frozen cathedrals, blue and ancient, cracked with pressure lines that looked like scars. Milo stayed close to me, too close, like he needed another human to keep him anchored in reality. "We make it to Camp 2. We rest, we get daylight, we get out," he muttered, as if repeating it could make it true. I kept my eyes on the path. I kept my hands steady on the rope. I kept telling myself I was only afraid of objective hazards, falling ice, avalanches, crevasses. Then my radio crackled. I nearly dropped it. Graham's channel was quiet by choice. We used it only for essential comms in the icefall. But this wasn't Graham. The voice was faint and close, like someone speaking directly into my ear. "Daniel, don't lag behind." My blood went cold because it wasn't an unknown voice. It sounded like my father. He'd been dead for 8 years. I froze mid-step, brain rebelling at the impossibility. The rope tugged. Milo stumbled, startled. "What are you doing?" he hissed. I forced myself forward, heart hammering so violently I could taste metal. "Keep moving," I said, but my voice was unsteady. The words felt borrowed. The radio crackled again, softer. "You always drifted, Danny. Always looking at the horizon instead of your feet." It knew my nickname. It knew the tone. It knew the specific disappointment in that voice, the kind that hooks into your chest. My throat tightened. Tears formed instantly, freezing at the corners of my eyes. Asha turned her head slightly, catching my hesitation. "Daniel," she said sharply, "eyes forward." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The radio went silent as quickly as it had spoken, as if it had gotten what it wanted. My attention, my emotion, my balance. We reached a narrow ladder crossing over a crevasse that exhaled cold air like an open freezer. One by one we clipped in, moved across, boots shaking the metal. When it was my turn, I kept my gaze on the rungs, not the void, not the dark depth below. Halfway across, the ladder vibrated, subtle at first, like wind touching it. Then it shook harder. My body went rigid. The rope pulled taut. The ladder swung slightly, not enough to throw me, but enough to make my stomach lurch. Milo's voice snapped behind me. "Daniel, move!" I moved, fighting panic, boots scraping. I reached the far side and dropped to my knees on solid ice, breathing like I'd been underwater. Graham came up beside me. "Earthquake," he muttered. Asha's eyes were fixed on the ladder, her face pale. "No," she said. "Something touched it." We didn't argue. We didn't stop. We continued upward, faster than our bodies wanted, driven by a silent agreement. Get out of the narrow corridors before whatever that was decided to close the distance. By the time faint dawn light seeped into the icefall, the glacier began to groan more loudly, warming, waking. The world turned blue-gray, shadows sharpened. Seracs loomed above like collapsing skyscrapers frozen mid-fall. And then, as we rounded a corner between two ice towers, we found a tent, not one of ours. It was wedged in a shallow depression, half buried in wind-blown snow. Its guy lines slack, its fabric stiff with frost. No headlamp inside, no movement, no footprints leading away. Asha stopped first. Her voice came out flat. "That's not right." Graham approached cautiously, clipped in, and touched the tent wall with a gloved knuckle. The fabric felt hard, like it had been frozen for days. But the storm cycle hadn't been that long. The tent looked abandoned in a way that didn't match the timeline. A muffled sound came from inside. Not a voice, not a cough, a slow, dragging scrape. Milo stepped back so fast he nearly tangled the rope. "No," he breathed. "No, no, no." Graham leaned close to the entrance zipper, the lines around his eyes tightening. "Hello?" he called. "If you're inside, respond." The scrape stopped. Then from inside the tent, so faint we all leaned in to be sure we heard it, a whisper came through the fabric. "Bring it higher." Asha's eyes snapped to mine. She had heard it too. Graham's face drained of colour. For the first time his denial faltered, just enough to reveal the fear underneath. His hand hovered near the zipper, then withdrew, as if the metal had burned him. "We move," he said, voice hoarse. "Now." We left the tent untouched. We didn't open it. We didn't try to help, because we didn't know if there was anyone left to help, or if opening that flap would invite something out into the corridor with us. We climbed in silence after that, and the silence wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of people who have crossed a line and know it. When Camp 2 finally came into view, the relief hit like a wave. Tents clustered on the snow platform. Sherpa moved calmly, hauling loads, cooking, fixing ropes. Human normality in the middle of white emptiness. We stumbled into camp like survivors returning from a shipwreck, but the camp's mood was wrong. Too quiet. Too many people standing in small groups, faces tense, voices hushed. A Sherpa we didn't know approached Tenzing, speaking rapidly. Tenzing's eyes narrowed, and he replied in the same sharp, clipped way I'd heard the night we first saw the figure. Asha caught fragments. "Another missing last night from Camp 2. He went out to pee, never came back." My stomach tightened. "At Camp 2?" I asked, even though no one was speaking to me. Asha's gaze stayed forward. "Yes." Milo's voice trembled. That's impossible. There are tents everywhere." Pasang's expression was tight with something like anger. "Not impossible," he said. "If you go alone." Graham ordered us into our tents immediately. "Hydrate, eat, rest," he said, but his eyes kept scanning the perimeter like he expected the snow itself to shift. Inside my tent, I finally broke. I pulled out the memory cards, hands shaking, and stared at them as if I could will them to be empty. Asha's words from earlier returned. "Carrying something alone up here will poison you," so I did what I should have done hours ago. I found Asha at the edge of camp, speaking quietly with Tenzing. When she saw my face, she didn't ask questions. She simply followed me into my tent and sat cross-legged, calm as if she was bracing for bad news. I slid the camera toward her. "There's another clip," I said. Asha didn't touch it immediately. "Recorded when you weren't there." I nodded. She exhaled slowly, then pressed play. We watched together in the dim light, shoulder to shoulder, two adults reduced to the wide-eyed silence of children. When the figure leaned toward the lens and whispered, Asha didn't flinch. But I saw her throat tighten. I saw her fingers curl into her palm. When the clip ended, she didn't speak for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "This is not altitude sickness." "No," I whispered. Asha looked at me with a strange steadiness, as if the fear had already crystallized into purpose. "We show Graham," she said. "He'll shut down," I argued. "He'll deny it." "Maybe," she replied, "but he's responsible for us. He deserves the truth." We found Graham in the mess tent, with a map spread out, talking to a liaison officer and another expedition leader. When Asha interrupted, he looked up sharply, irritation rising, until he saw the camera in my hands. Something in his face shifted. We played the clip without theatrics, no speeches, no accusations, just the raw file in the thin air on a small screen that suddenly felt like the most dangerous object on the mountain. When the whisper came, "Bring it higher," Graham's eyes flickered as if someone had slapped him. He didn't speak when it ended. The liaison officer cleared his throat nervously. "Could be interference. A prank." Graham didn't look at him. He looked at Tenzing, Tenzing's expression was stone. "Not prank," he said. "It wants." "What?" Graham snapped, his control finally cracking. "What does it want?" Tenzing answered without emotion. "You bring camera. You look. It look back." Graham's hands trembled slightly as he folded the map, an unconscious gesture like he wanted to pack the whole situation away. "We end this," he said suddenly. "We descend today. We go back to base camp." Relief surged in me so hard it almost made me dizzy. But then the storm cycle reminded us that Everest decides, not us. A Sherpa burst into the tent, speaking fast to Pasang. Pasang's face tightened. He turned to Graham. "Weather changed," he said. "Wind high coming, icefall dangerous later. If we go down now, maybe." "Then we go now," Graham barked. Outside, the sky was already shifting, thin clouds threading across the ridges, wind lifting snow off the high slopes in ghostly banners. The mountain's mood was turning. We packed in a frantic rush, tents zipped, gear clipped, ropes coiled, bodies moving on adrenaline. Camp 2 turned into a scrambling hive as other teams reacted to the same forecast. We roped up and started down toward the icefall. And that's when I noticed it. A line of footprints leading away from camp, not boot prints, not crampon marks, long steps, deep impressions, spaced in a way that suggested speed and confidence. They headed toward a low ridge just beyond the last tents, into a dip where the wind carved shadows into the snow. Asha saw them too, her eyes locked on mine. Graham was shouting orders, pushing the team forward, but I couldn't stop looking at that trail. It felt like bait, like a deliberate message. "I can walk through your camp whenever I want." Milo's voice came tight. Don't follow that." I wasn't planning to, but my body was already drifting, the way the radio voice had accused me of drifting. The camera felt heavier against my chest, as if it wanted to pull me toward that ridge. Tenzing stepped in front of me, blocking the line of footprints with his body. His eyes were hard. "No," he said. A gust slammed into camp, violent enough to yank at packs and snap loose straps. Snow lifted, stinging our faces, and through that gust, faint but unmistakable, my radio crackled again, even though I hadn't touched it. A whisper, close and intimate, like breath against my ear. "Higher." I jerked the radio away, as if distance could help. My heart hammered. Asha grabbed my arm hard, anchoring me. Graham's voice cut through the chaos. "Move!" We pushed into the descent as the wind rose, the sky whitening, visibility shrinking. The icefall waited below like a mouth opening. Half an hour later, with the storm thickening around us, Pasang stopped abruptly and pointed. Ahead, across the route, a serac had shifted. A new fracture line ran like a lightning bolt through the ice, and one of the ladder bridges we'd crossed earlier hung at a different angle now, twisted, unstable, half-detached from its anchor. Graham stared, calculating. "We can still pass," he said, but his voice lacked certainty. Tenzing shook his head. "Icefall change fast. Now is bad." Behind us, wind howled, erasing our tracks. Above us, the mountain disappeared into a wall of spinning snow. We were trapped between an icefall that was breaking beneath us and a storm that was closing the door behind us. And in the center of that tightening vice, I felt the camera against my chest like a beacon, like the one thing on our bodies that didn't belong to us anymore. Asha leaned close, shouting over the wind. "We need shelter!" Graham's eyes darted, left, right, finding a shallow depression near an ice wall. "There!" he shouted. "We bivouac. We wait it out. Everyone together. No one goes alone." We stumbled toward the ice wall, pressed in close, packs forming a crude barrier against wind. Snow filled every gap, breath turned to frost, time distorted, minutes felt like hours. And then, through the roar of the storm, I heard it again, the clicking, not in my radio, not in the wind, from inside the ice wall itself, as if something on the other side was tapping patiently, right where we huddled. Milo's eyes widened in pure terror. "It's here," he mouthed. The clicking grew closer, traveling along the ice, circling us the way it had circled the tent. Slow, curious, controlled. Asher squeezed my arm so hard it hurt, and in that pain, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. It didn't need to chase us. It could wait, because it wasn't hunting our bodies. It was hunting what we were carrying. And as the storm thickened into a white curtain, Graham shouted one desperate plan into our huddle, words that hit me like a punch. "We drop the camera," he said. "We leave it. If that's what it wants, we give it what it wants." Asher's gaze snapped to me, and in her eyes I saw the question neither of us wanted to ask out loud. If we surrender it here, will it let us live? Or will it finally come close enough for us to see what it really is? Graham's words hung in the storm like a flare. We dropped the camera. For a second I couldn't process them. The camera was our purpose, our proof, the thing that justified every risk we'd taken to get this high. But in the whiteout, pressed against an ice wall with spindrift cutting our faces and the glacier shifting somewhere below like a slow beast, the camera suddenly felt like something else. A lure. Asher's eyes stayed locked on mine. Milo looked like he might vomit. Tenzing and Pasang didn't react with surprise, only with a grim acceptance that made my stomach tighten, as if they'd been waiting for the foreigners to finally understand what the Sherpa already knew. The clicking continued behind the ice, patient and close. I pulled the camera tighter against my chest instinctively, as if it were a child. My mind raced through the consequences. If we abandoned it, we'd lose the footage, the documentary, the contracts, the money. But those were distant problems. The immediate problem was simpler. If it wanted the camera, that meant it could see it. And if it could see it, that meant it was already near enough to choose. Graham leaned close, shouting over the wind so only we could hear. "Daniel, you're the one carrying it. Do it." I stared at him. "You're telling me to sacrifice the only evidence we have. I'm telling you to keep everyone alive." Another crack boomed through the icefall, deeper than thunder. The ice wall vibrated against our backs. Powder poured down like smoke. Asher's voice cut in, controlled but urgent. "We can't stay here long. The Serac is shifting. Decision now." The clicking stopped. The sudden silence punched through the storm noise like a vacuum. I felt every hair rise beneath my layers. Then, right beside us, so close I thought the ice wall would split open, came a slow exhale, a breath. It rolled through the crack lines in the ice like air through a flute, low and deliberate, as if something on the other side was testing how humans react to being that close to its lungs. Milo made a small sound in his throat, a trapped sob. I didn't think anymore. I moved. I unclipped the camera from my chest harness with numb fingers, fighting the stiff buckles. The camera felt impossibly heavy now, not from weight, but from meaning. I held it in both hands, my headlamp beam catching the matte body, the lens hood rimmed with frost. "Please," Milo whispered, "just do it." I wanted to throw it. I wanted to fling it as far from us as possible. But another instinct pushed in, an irrational, protective need to place it carefully, like an offering that had to be presented correctly. That thought scared me more than the clicking. I crawled a few steps away from the huddle, staying clipped to the rope, boots scraping for purchase. The wind tried to rip the camera from my hands. Snow stung my eyes. Visibility was no more than a few meters. I set the camera on the snow, lens angled upward, toward the invisible bulk of the mountain above. And as I did, the wind faltered. Not fully, but enough to make the air feel suddenly close, like the storm was holding its breath again. Behind me, Graham hissed, "Back! Back!" I scrambled toward the group, heart hammering. The clicking began again, this time not behind the ice, but in front of us, out in the storm. Click, 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 slow, measured, approaching the camera. I stared into the white haze, headlamp beams slicing through snow. Shapes danced at the edge of vision, spindrift, shadows, my own fear. Then something darker moved through it, crossing the beam without reflecting light. A figure, taller than any man. It didn't walk. It glided, as if the snow was irrelevant, as if gravity had negotiated different terms for it. It reached the camera. The headlamp beam caught a flash of pale surface, smooth, faintly reflective, where a face should have been. No eyes, no mouth. And yet, I felt something like a tension, as if the shape could see without needing features. The figure leaned down. The clicking stopped. For one suspended moment, the storm went quiet enough that I could hear my own pulse thudding in my ears. Then the camera's red recording light blinked on. My blood turned to ice. I hadn't turned it on. It turned on by itself, like a response to contact, like the thing understood that the camera wasn't just an object, but a tool to be activated. The figure remained bent over it, and I saw its long arm extend, too smooth, too continuous, not bulky with clothing or gear. It didn't press buttons like a human. It simply hovered, and the camera obeyed. Graham's voice came out ragged. "Don't look at it. Don't engage." But I couldn't stop. The camera, our camera, began to tilt upward, slowly, as if someone was lifting it by the grip. Except there was no hand around it. It rose from the snow. Asha gasped softly, a sound torn free despite her discipline. The camera floated for a heartbeat, then drifted closer to the figure, as if drawn into its shadow, and the figure, still faceless, turned its head toward us. Even without eyes, I felt the weight of that attention slam into my chest. In my radio, static bloomed. Then a voice, calm, intimate, and impossibly close, whispered through my earpiece. "Good." The storm returned all at once, roaring like it had been unleashed. The figure and the camera dissolved into the white, swallowed as if they'd never existed. The clicking vanished. We stood frozen, trembling, staring at empty snow. Milo's voice cracked. "It took it." Graham didn't answer. He was staring at the whiteness as if expecting it to come back. Tenzing spoke first, his tone flat. "Now it leave," he said. Pasang nodded. Maybe. That word, maybe, was a knife. We waited, shivering, pressed against the ice wall until the wind eased enough to see shapes again. When visibility improved slightly, Graham made the call. We move. We push down through the icefall before it changes further. Without the camera, without the footage, without our original mission, just survival. And something did feel different. The air wasn't as tight. The silence didn't sit on our shoulders the same way. It was still Everest, still dangerous, still indifferent, but the specific pressure we'd felt, the sense of being watched from a distance that wasn't distance at all, had loosened. As we descended, the icefall still groaned and snapped, but the clicking never returned. The radio stayed silent except for our own clipped communications. No father's voice, no whispers, no instructions. We crossed the damaged ladder section with extreme care, one by one, heartbeats synchronized with each rung. The glacier shifted once, a deep rumble that made us freeze, but it held long enough for us to pass. By late afternoon we reached Camp Y, exhausted and hollowed out. People looked up as we arrived, eyes searching for our camera cases, our gear, our usual signs of a successful carry. Graham didn't stop to explain. He simply ordered tents zipped and hot drinks made. The tone of his voice brooked no questions. That night, the storm continued above, but Camp Y remained relatively calm. Inside my tent I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fabric. My chest felt wrong without the weight of the camera harness. It was like missing a limb. Asha came to my tent entrance just after midnight. She didn't crawl inside. She spoke through the flap, voice low. "You did the right thing." "Did I?" I whispered back. There was a pause. "We're alive," she said. "That's the only measure that matters up here." I wanted to believe her. But guilt gnawed at me, not just for losing the equipment, but for something more personal. It took the camera because I placed it down, because I obeyed. The next morning, we descended to base camp. The lower we went, the thicker the air became, and with it the world regained its normal shape. Base camp was bustling, alive, cooks shouting, Sherpa laughing, climbers arguing about weather and logistics. It should have felt safe. But when we arrived, our liaison officer pulled Graham aside immediately, his face strained. Asher translated in fragments the missing climber from Camp 2, found. Not alive, not intact. Discovered near the perimeter of camp, as if he'd been placed there. No tracks leading to him, no clear cause. The familiar chill crept into my stomach again. Graham's shoulders sagged under the news, like an old man carrying a fresh burden. We spent that day in enforced rest. Doctors checked our oxygen levels. We drank liters of tea and soup. We sat in our tents and tried to act like we were simply exhausted, not shaken to the marrow. By evening, Graham called us together in the main tent, where a heater rattled and made the air smell like fuel. He looked at each of us in turn, his face drawn. "We're done," he said. "Expedition over. We go down to Kathmandu. No summit, no more filming, no debate." Milo exhaled a sob of relief. Asher nodded once, as if she'd already decided that days ago. I felt my chest unclench for the first time in what felt like weeks, and then Graham added, "There's one more thing." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, like something fragile. A memory card, black plastic, frosted at the edges. Milo frowned. "Where did you get that?" Graham's eyes were haunted. "It was inside my tent this afternoon." Silence slammed into the room. I stared at it, unable to breathe. "That's," I began, but my voice died. Graham nodded slowly, his throat tight. "Yes, our card." Asher's voice was barely a whisper. "That's impossible." Graham's hands trembled as he set it on the table between us, like a loaded weapon. "I didn't tell anyone about the clip," he said. "I didn't ask anyone to search for the camera, yet this showed up. Clean, dry, like it had never been in the storm." Tenzing's eyes lowered. He looked almost resigned. "It give back," he said. Milo swallowed hard. "Why would it give it back?" Tenzing didn't answer. Pasang did, in blunt English. "Because it wants you to see." My skin prickled. Graham looked at me. "Daniel," he said quietly, "you're the one who knows the camera best. If we play this, we play it together, all of us." Every instinct screamed to destroy it, to snap it in half, bury it, burn it. But another force pulled me, curiosity, dread, the same magnetic compulsion that had made me drift toward the footprints. Asher's hand touched my wrist, grounding me. "Together," she murmured. I inserted the memory card into my backup camera body, one we'd kept at base camp, safe from the icefall. The small screen lit up. A single file appeared, a new clip. No label, no metadata that made sense. I pressed play. The first image made my stomach drop. The view was from our camera, but it wasn't facing us. It was facing upward, toward the mountain, moving smoothly, as if carried by something that didn't stumble. We were climbing, ascending, through a corridor of ice I didn't recognize. Not the icefall, not the western Sidibiduem. The walls were too smooth, too close, like the inside of a frozen tunnel. The camera glided forward, deeper. The light changed. The ice began to glow faintly from within, pale blue-green, as if lit by something ancient trapped under layers of snow. Then the tunnel opened into a wide cavern. I gasped without meaning to. The cavern ceiling arched high above, ribbed with ice formations that looked like bones. The floor was polished, almost mirror-smooth, reflecting the camera's movement like water. And in the center of the cavern stood shapes, several of them, tall, narrow silhouettes arranged in a circle, not moving, waiting. The camera drifted closer, and one of the figures turned its head toward the lens in that same smooth, weightless way. The clicking began on the audio track, louder now, echoing in the cavern. Then a voice, not a whisper, filled the recording. Calm, human-sounding, almost gentle. You brought it higher. The figures in the circle began to shift, not stepping but sliding, converging toward the camera. The lens tilted upward, as if forced to look at the ceiling. And there, embedded in the ice above them, were objects, dark shapes frozen into the glacier like insects in amber. At first my brain refused to recognize them. Then it did. Cameras, dozens of cameras, old models, new models, GoPros, DSLRs, cinema bodies like ours, frozen into the ceiling, all angled downward, as if they'd been collected and stored. A museum of stolen eyes. Milo let out a strangled sound. Oh my God! Asha's face was white. How many? The camera drifted beneath the ceiling of frozen lenses, each one staring down, trapped forever mid-record. Then the image jolted slightly, not like a human stumble, but like a deliberate adjustment. The frame centered on one particular camera, embedded in the ice. It was ours. And behind it, deeper in the ice, something darker moved, massive, indistinct, like a shadow behind frosted glass. The clicking stopped. The voice spoke again, softer, closer. Now you will remember. The screen went black. For a moment, none of us breathed. Then the heater rattled louder, as if the camp was trying to remind us that we were still human, still alive, still in a tent made of fabric and hope. Graham's voice came out hoarse. We leave. Immediately. Tonight if we can. Tenzing nodded. Yes. Milo's hands shook violently. We need to show someone. Authorities, scientists, someone. Asha cut him off. Not harshly, but firmly. And say what? That Everest stole our camera and showed us a cave full of cameras. They'll medicate us. Graham stared at the dark screen like it might turn back on. We don't show it, he said. We bury it. We forget it. But even as he said it, I knew the truth. We wouldn't forget, because something had made sure of that. That night, as base camp slept, I walked alone to the edge of the glacier with the memory card in my pocket, the weight of it pressing against my thigh like a promise. I planned to bury it in the snow, to let the mountain keep its secret. But when I reached the edge of camp, I stopped dead. In the fresh snow, leading away from the tents and into the darkness, was a line of long footprints. And beside the footprints, perfectly placed as if set there by a careful hand, was a small black object. Another memory card, half buried, waiting. An invitation, a warning, or proof that it was never finished with us. I stood there trembling, the cold biting my lungs, and realized the most terrifying part wasn't what we'd seen on the mountain. It was what the mountain had seen in us. And somewhere in the dark beyond the camp, something clicked, slow and patient, like teeth tapping together, counting the seconds until we looked back.